The courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was paralyzed. A tension so sharp it might have drawn blood. You could hear the weight of what had just been said settle across the room like a sheet of iron. Jasmine Crockett stood centered beneath the lights, her frame still, her expression honed. No script, no hesitation, just fire delivered with elegance. You played the part of a porcelain doll while the house behind you burned. The air shuddered. All eyes turned, some to the judge, some to Melania Trump, and others just stared straight ahead, too stunned to blink. Melania didn't flinch. Her posture remained impeccable, frozen in that practiced elegance she'd worn like armor for years. But her hands betrayed her. White-knuckled, clenched in her lap, one thumb twitching against the other. The gallery shifted. Cameras clicked in the silence, a frantic attempt to preserve this exact second in history. On the table before Jasmine lay the document that had just set the chamber ablaze. A handwritten letter, never released, drafted by Melania on the afternoon of January 6th. Cropped language, passive phrases, no names, no condemnation, just vague nods to peace, civility, and the American spirit. Beside it, security footage, time-stamped. Melania walking through the East Wing while the Capitol was under siege, wearing a coat, not stopping to ask questions. Jasmine stepped closer to the bench, voice unwavering. History will not remember the First Lady who redecorated the Rose Garden while her husband called for a mob. A collective gasp swept through the room. One Republican aide stood, shouted objection, drowned beneath the chorus of murmurs now breaking across the courtroom. The judge banged the gavel once, twice, then gave up. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. And the unspoken question now hovered like smoke. Was Melania Trump merely distant, or was she the final veil protecting something far more deliberate? She was never meant to be political. That was the script. The public was told again and again she was a wife, a mother, a former model who just wanted to be left alone. But in a White House where every moment was orchestrated, nothing was ever just coincidence, and absence, especially in politics, is never neutral. Jasmine Crockett stood before the congressional panel, voice low but sharpened by conviction. They told us she stayed out of politics, that she was private, but silence isn't privacy, it's strategy. The statement struck a nerve. Senator Collins shifted in her seat. A staffer jotted something down too quickly, nearly ripping the page. On the defense bench, Melania remained stone still, her eyes fixed forward, but her stillness had begun to look more like deflection than dignity. Crockett clicked the remote, cueing a sequence of slides behind her. Date-stamped headlines, White House press photos, speech transcripts, a digital archive of absence. March 2017. Trump announces the first version of the Muslim ban. No public statement from the First Lady. Click. August 2017, Charlottesville. Very fine people on both sides. No address, no tweet, no outreach. Click. June 2018, family separation policy, border cages, no visit. Until, of course, the jacket. The screen froze on a photo of Melania exiting a plane, wearing the olive green coat with its now infamous backprint. I really don't care, do you? Crockett let the silence linger. The room was suffocating in it. She spoke again, slower this time. You don't get to detach when the man next to you is using power to harm people. You don't get to play coy while standing on the balcony of oppression. Across the room, a conservative columnist whispered into her phone. A legal analyst mouthed. This just escalated. A murmur pulsed through the back rows. Because this wasn't just a commentary on Melania's actions, it was a direct dismantling of the cultural myth that First Ladies, particularly white First Ladies, can stand near power without sharing its weight. Crockett moved toward the bench, her gaze sweeping the room. She wasn't powerless. She was protected. Melania's lawyer objected. Speculative, irrelevant to the purpose of this hearing. But Crockett didn't flinch. She spoke directly to the objection. Irrelevant. Let me remind you, this hearing is about complicity, about who knew what and who chose comfort over conscience. The judge motioned for order, but her tone was firm, not dismissive. She let it stand. Crockett turned to the jury. She told us she didn't want to be involved, and yet she was in every room that mattered. When children were detained, when rights were rolled back, when lies became law, she was there. She just chose not to speak. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Not anymore!" Heads turned. The tension tightened. Jasmine returned to her seat slowly, not triumphant, but certain. The foundation was set. This wasn't about shaming Melania Trump. This was about unmasking the architecture of silence that had protected her for 4 long years. The courtroom had begun to feel it, and Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. The projector screen lit up again, this time with an aerial photograph of the White House rose garden, stripped of its vibrant crabapple trees, stripped of the Jackie Kennedy-era blossoms, replaced with muted, symmetrical hedges. Stone, space, sterility. It was Melania Trump's redesign, unveiled in the summer of 2020. Crockett stepped forward again, her heels measured against the marble floor. "We were told this was a legacy project, a timeless restoration," she began. "But legacy," she paused, "should not be built in the shadow of national ruin." She clicked again. The screen split. On one side, Melania, crisp white dress, standing poised in the new rose garden. On the other, footage from that same summer. Protesters choking on tear gas in Lafayette Square, coffins lined up from COVID surges, ice raids in neighborhoods just miles away. The contrast hit like a slap. This wasn't just a renovation, it was a redirection, a calculated distraction. A murmur rippled through the audience. Crockett could feel the shift in the room, not just discomfort, but awakening. While families mourned outside hospitals, while Americans lost jobs and homes, the East Wing was fast-tracking irrigation plans. Melania's counsel objected again. "This is speculative and designed purely for optics." But the judge didn't interject this time. She leaned back. Let it breathe. Jasmine continued. "We submitted a FOIA request for the Rose Garden redesign documents. What we found," she gestured toward the next slide, "was that key contracts were finalized in late May 2020, the same week George Floyd died." The courtroom fell utterly still. Crockett let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "I'm not suggesting she orchestrated brutality. I'm saying she chose beauty while the country bled." A Republican senator leaned toward her aide, whispering furiously. A journalist at the back scribbled, underlined, and underlined again. "And this isn't just about Melania, it's about a broader political disease," Jasmine said, turning back to the room. "The performance of grace, of apoliticism, of tasteful detachment." She gestured once more to the 2 images frozen side by side. "One is an administration reshaping the national soul. The other is a garden." Her tone was flat, but her words carved deep. "And when you choose symmetry over suffering, when you spend your power on petals while your people burn, history will not write you gently." Melania still hadn't moved, but her jawline had tightened. A flicker of something, indignation maybe, twitched beneath the surface of her practiced calm. A young black mother seated in the public gallery exhaled through her nose, quiet but sharp. Crockett caught her eye, not long, but long enough. This wasn't about flowers. This was about priorities, about power, about the devastating illusion that elegance equals innocence. The judge cleared her throat. The silence stretched a few moments longer before the next phase would begin, and Jasmine Crockett turned the page, not on decor, but on denial. Because the real story wasn't in the roses, it was in everything that bloomed while the country wilted. The exhibit screen now displayed a single sheet of cream stationery. At first glance it was unremarkable, standard East Wing letterhead, faintly watermarked, the Trump insignia centered at the top, but the content was what made the room lean forward. Jasmine Crockett remained still for a moment, letting the room digest the image. Then she spoke. This was never released to the public, it was never read aloud, but it was written by the former First Lady on January 6, 2021. The courtroom tensed. Even the judge arched her brows slightly curious. "This," Jasmine continued, is Melania Trump's draft letter, discovered in a file labeled Flotus Comms, internal only, recovered by a former aide during a personal digital archive review. It was written sometime between 3:45 and 4:10 p.m., while this capital was under siege. She turned, clicked the monitor. The words of the draft letter filled the screen. Violence is never the answer. We must strive for peace, civility, and national healing. I call on all Americans to remember the strength of unity and the dignity of our democratic institutions. No mention of Trump. No mention of the insurrection. No mention of the deaths, the broken windows, or the vice president being evacuated. Crockett's voice lowered. And yet, no mention of the president, the rioters, or even the reason for the unrest. This wasn't a condemnation. It was a PR memo written in cursive. On the defense bench, Melania remained rigid. Her attorney looked nervous, lips pressed into a line. Jasmine stepped forward slowly. I want the court to consider what silence sounds like in print. Because this letter wasn't neutral, it was designed to preserve the distance, the illusion, the mask of detachment. She clicked again. Now a time-stamped video appeared. Melania walking through the East Wing hallways that afternoon, escorted by Secret Service. Aides trail behind her, whispering. She glances at her phone but says nothing, not even as sirens echo faintly from the television screens inside press offices. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't isolated. She was walking the hallways, aware of everything unfolding. There was a sharp intake of breath in the gallery. Then Jasmine delivered the cut. This draft was read by two senior aides. One advised against releasing it. The other deleted the final file. A hand in the press gallery shot up. A reporter whispered to another, and in the third row, a retired Capitol police officer clenched his jaw. Jasmine continued, softer now. You see, this letter wasn't pulled back because it was too harsh. It was pulled back because it was too empty. Because even in the hour of national collapse, the First Lady wouldn't name the man holding the match. Melania's attorney finally rose. Objection. This is speculation. We have no evidence the First Lady personally chose not to release the letter. Jasmine turned to face the objection. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver. What we do have are internal timestamps, email headers, calendar logs, and the affidavit of a senior staffer who says Melania reviewed the letter, then said, and I quote, "Now is not the time to pick sides." A tremor ran through the courtroom. She wasn't protecting democracy, Crockett added. She was protecting proximity to power. The judge considered for a moment, then ruled. Objection noted, but the evidence and supporting testimony are admissible for context. And just like that, the letter became more than a relic. It became a confession, not in what it said, but in what it didn't. Jasmine let the silence sit again before concluding. This wasn't just a missed opportunity for leadership. It was a moral failure. Because when the country needed a voice from within those walls to say stop, she said nothing. And nothing in that moment was louder than violence. She turned to the jury box. Half were still staring at the screen. The other half were staring at Melania. There are silences that echo, Jasmine whispered. And there are silences that erase. On January 6th, she chose the second. From somewhere in the back of the room, someone cleared their throat. In another corner, a juror reached for a pen they hadn't touched in an hour. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a truth commission. And Melania Trump's carefully preserved detachment had just torn at the seams. Ask ChatGPT. A different kind of silence now filled the courtroom. Heavier, more personal, the kind that came when the room knew it was about to walk into something raw, something layered in contradiction. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush it. She stood before the bench and placed a new file onto the evidence stand. Let's talk, she said, her tone measured. About how one woman's quiet path to citizenship became a shield, while others were punished just for trying. She clicked the remote. The screen behind her flickered to a timeline. Melania Trump's immigration history. Slovenia to modeling visas. The 2001 Einstein EB-1 green card. Citizenship in 2006. all legal, all fast-tracked, all rarely spoken about during her husband's presidency. Melania was granted one of the most competitive visas in our immigration system, one typically reserved for Nobel laureates, world-class researchers, or Olympic athletes. Her qualification? Modeling. She let the statement land without bitterness, just facts laid bare. The defense counsel stood. The First Lady's immigration journey was entirely within the bounds of the law. Jasmine turned. And that's not the issue. The issue, she said, stepping forward, is how that same system was weaponized against everyone else, while she said nothing. Click. Split screen. One side showed a photo of Melania in a powder blue Ralph Lauren coat on Inauguration Day. The other, a Honduran mother screaming as her child was taken at the border. The Trump administration separated over 5,000 families under zero-tolerance policies. Toddlers cried in cages while Melania dined at diplomatic banquets. She raised a hand before the defense could object again. I'm not asking the court to condemn her for her path. I'm asking why she didn't use it, her voice, her story, to stop what was being done in her husband's name. Jasmine stepped away from the podium and called the next witness. Ana Delgado. A schoolteacher, U.S. citizen, and daughter of 2 deported parents. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with each word. My mother worked in a hotel cleaning rooms. My father laid concrete. They were denied asylum after 10 years in this country, and while we begged ICE for answers, I saw her on the TV, wearing designer gowns, staying silent. She paused, swallowing hard. I don't blame her for being here. I blame her for pretending her story had nothing to do with ours. Silence fell again. Not awkward, not forced, just real. Jasmine walked slowly to the center of the courtroom. She had a story millions of people could have related to. She had the power to say, look at me. I am an immigrant too. I am the face of the dream you are now criminalizing. But instead, she stood beside the man who called immigrants rapists and invaders, and said nothing. The camera panned across the room. Juror lowered his eyes. A young aide on the Republican bench tapped her pen nervously against her notebook. Jasmine finished quietly. It wasn't her immigration status that failed us. It was her silence, her refusal to be more than ornamental, her unwillingness to turn privilege into empathy. Melania didn't react. But something had shifted. Because now, the courtroom wasn't just questioning the legality of her journey, it was questioning what kind of legacy is built when you walk through the golden door and let it slam shut behind you. No words had ever echoed louder than 4 painted across a $39 Zara jacket. Jasmine Crockett knew it. The world knew it. But this courtroom had never been forced to sit with what it actually meant. She stepped forward, remote in hand, and clicked. The photo reappeared like a ghost. Melania Trump descending the steps of a government plane, headed to a child detention facility in Texas. Her back turned to the camera, the jacket blaring in block letters. I really don't care, do you? The room stiffened. Even those who had seen the image 100 times instinctively reacted. The stillness of the moment made it feel fresh, offensive all over again. She claimed it was for the media. Jasmine said softly, a misfire, a misstep, maybe even a joke. Click. The next slide showed the same jacket, worn again after the backlash, not once, twice. And yet, Jasmine continued, after being told how deeply it hurt children, parents, and aid workers, she wore it again. Melania's lawyer leaned forward, whispering something urgent. But Jasmine wasn't finished. This wasn't just a fashion accident, it was a statement. The kind of statement you make when you want the world to know you are untouchable, when cruelty becomes performance. She let that hang in the air. A senator shifted uncomfortably. A juror folded their arms. The judge scribbled something but didn't raise her eyes. Crockett kept going, her voice still low but firm. The First Lady didn't visit detention centers before this. She didn't return after. There was no press conference, no op-ed, just the jacket, just the message. She turned to the gallery. And what was that message? That she wasn't responsible? That she wasn't involved? or that at the height of our national shame, she really didn't care. An audible sigh came from somewhere near the back. Someone else whispered, "She said it herself." Jasmine glanced at Melania. The former First Lady sat motionless, a marble figure carved from practiced restraint, but her fingers were pressed so tightly together they trembled slightly. Jasmine softened, just slightly. "We're not here to try fashion. We're here to try power." And in that moment, on that runway to that prison of children, Melania Trump used her power to mock the very people her husband was incarcerating. She paused, and America noticed. The courtroom remained quiet, but the energy had shifted again. Because this time the evidence didn't come from leaked documents or hidden letters. It came from an image everyone remembered, but no one had truly been forced to answer for. Crockett ended the chapter with one line, not shouted, not dramatic, just devastating. When the nation was crying out for compassion, the First Lady turned her back and said, "I don't care." She stepped away. The jacket still lingered on the screen behind her, a cold monument to a woman who, when finally seen, told us not to bother looking. The next piece of evidence wasn't flashy. It wasn't viral or infamous like the jacket, but it was quieter, and in many ways, more damning. Jasmine Crockett stood at the lectern, holding a slim manila folder. She tapped it once, then laid it flat on the podium. "What we have here," she began, "are internal White House East Wing memos. Memos sent by senior staff to the First Lady's office during the peak of the family separation policy, and left unanswered." Jasmine Crockett stood at the lectern, holding a slim manila folder. She tapped it once, then laid it flat on the podium. "What we have here," she began, "are internal White House East Wing memos. Memos sent by senior staff to the First Lady's office during the peak of the family separation policy, and left unanswered." A court officer delivered photocopies to the jury box. The rustling of paper was the only sound. "These aren't classified," Jasmine clarified. "They're not sealed. They're public record now. But for 4 years, they were buried under silence." She let that land. "They begged for visibility. They asked for site visits. They proposed joint press statements with HHS. And each time, what was the reply?" She turned to the judge's monitor and clicked. "No response." Click. "Unanswered." Click. "Referred to communications team, no follow-up." She looked up. The First Lady's team didn't object. They didn't push back. They didn't argue the facts. They simply did nothing. Melania's attorney rose. "Objection. Lack of direct evidence that the First Lady herself received these documents." But Jasmine was ready. "We also have testimony from former East Wing Chief of Staff Stephanie Grisham, who confirmed under oath that Melania read these briefings daily." Click. A transcript appeared on screen. The words were clear. Yes, the First Lady reviewed those updates. Whether she took action or not, that was her choice. There it was. A choice. Crockett's voice deepened, steady and somber. A mother, presented with evidence of traumatized children, a former immigrant herself, shown images of babies in cages, and she chose silence. She stepped forward now, her tone not angry but haunting. She chose to stay in the East Wing, to tweet about Christmas decor, to redesign the White House tennis pavilion. And when the nation begged her to show heart, she offered porcelain calm. From the gallery, murmurs stirred. Someone exhaled sharply. Even Melania seemed to blink more than usual. "And I want to be clear," Jasmine added. "This isn't about duty. The First Lady is not an elected official. She is not bound by oath." She held the room. "But when you stand in the House of Power and you inherit a platform larger than most heads of state, what do you owe the people watching you?" Silence answered her. She leaned into the final line like a scalpel. "Because when you have the power to soften cruelty, and you choose not to, that silence becomes complicity." The courtroom was still. The judge didn't intervene. The Republican bench shifted but didn't object again. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. She returned to her seat without fanfare, leaving behind a stack of unanswered memos that now screamed louder than any headline ever had. And on the bench, Melania Trump sat with her jaw clenched, her stillness no longer serene, but forced. The mask of detachment was cracking. For the first time, her silence was no longer invisible. It was evidence. It wasn't a bombshell that shattered the courtroom next. It was a mirror. One Jasmine Crockett held up, slowly, steadily, and without trembling. "We were told a story," she said, rising again, her voice quiet but firm. "A modern American fairy tale. A beautiful immigrant woman becomes First Lady, a symbol of elegance, silence, and grace, a counterweight to her husband's chaos." She looked around, letting the words stretch across the air like a thread pulled taut. "But fairy tales are for bedtime, and this," she swept her hand to the documents spread across the table. "This was history. Real, bloody, unforgiving." On the screen behind her, a clip played. Archival footage of Melania Trump beside her husband, stone-faced, as he declared zero tolerance at the border. Jasmine didn't need to narrate. The contrast was already doing its work. America watched a woman walk through the rose garden in designer heels while ICE tore mothers from babies in detention centers. Jasmine continued, voice rising now. "We were asked to see grace where there was absence, softness where there was avoidance, and when children cried in cages, we were told, 'Be best.'" A ripple of restrained laughter broke out in the gallery. The judge shot a glance toward the audience, but didn't gavel. It wasn't mocking. It was bitter recognition. "But today," Jasmine said, lowering her voice to a whisper, "we're not in a White House press room. We're not on Fox News. We're in a court of public record, and we are entitled, not to fantasy, but to truth." She turned toward Melania. "You were there when Charlottesville happened." A pause. "You were there when he called nations like mine shithole countries." She stepped closer to the jury now. "You watched as journalists were called the enemy, as truth became collateral damage. And while this country burned in protests, you posed for photos beside Christmas trees made of blood-red branches." Melania's face didn't change, but her shoulders stiffened. Her hands, once poised on her lap, gripped the edge of the defense table. Jasmine looked at her again, not with scorn, but something colder. Pity. "You were not his puppet," she said. "You were his mirror, silent when silence protected him, soft when softness served him, and distant when distance could be mistaken for dignity." The courtroom was silent, as if holding its breath. "And for that," Jasmine said, "history may not convict you, but it will not spare you either." There was no need for theatrics now, no closing crescendo. Crockett walked back to her table like someone who knew the jury no longer needed convincing. Only time. Melania Trump sat frozen. The public mask held, but beneath it something had cracked. Not because she was outed down, but because the myth was peeled away in layers. No dramatic collapse, no weeping confession, just the slow, painful realization that the role she had played, the beautiful silence, the foreign-born First Lady, the distant, elegant shadow, had not shielded her legacy. It had etched it in stone. The judge finally broke the silence. "Court will recess until tomorrow." Gavel. Everyone stood. The murmurs began again, but this time they were different. Not outrage, not applause, something else. Recognition. The fairy tale was over. The curtain had fallen. And what lay behind it was not cruelty or villainy, but the far more damning truth. Indifference. And indifference, history would remember. Morning came like a thundercloud. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, elbows locked, lenses extended, waiting. The crowd had doubled overnight, spilling into the streets. They weren't just there for the verdict. They were there for something harder to define, closure perhaps, or reckoning, or just the chance to say they'd witnessed it. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with electricity. Every seat filled. No voices raised. No arguments made. Just the heavy breath of anticipation. Jasmine Crockett sat calmly, her hands folded, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't look at the jury, not yet. Melania Trump had not returned. Her lawyer sat alone at the defense table, expression unreadable. Then, the door opened. The jury entered. 12 citizens, none of them famous, none of them wealthy, all of them now symbols of a choice that transcended politics. The foreperson stood. In the matter of obstruction by omission, we, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. Responsible. The word rang like a bell in a cathedral. Not guilty. This was a congressional tribunal, not a criminal court. But responsible. It carried weight. Political, historical, moral. Gasps echoed through. The gallery. Outside, word traveled fast. Phones lit up. News anchors leaned forward on live feeds. Inside, Jasmine didn't move. Not a smile, not a smirk. Just a slow, quiet nod, as if she'd already known. The judge leaned forward. Let the record reflect the jury's unanimous finding. This court concludes its proceedings. Gavel. Final this time. And then, silence again. But this time it wasn't stunned. It was heavy with knowing. Like a room that had finally let out the breath it didn't realize it was holding. Jasmine stood and gathered her papers. The weight of the trial didn't seem to press on her. But there was weariness in her shoulders, the kind that follows not victory, but survival. As she moved to leave, a young reporter caught up with her just outside the chamber doors. Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe this changes anything? She stopped, turned slowly. It changes the record, she said. And history begins with records. The reporter blinked. But what about consequences? Jasmine met his eyes, not with fire, but with clarity. Consequences come later, she said. Always later, but they start here. She turned and walked down the marble steps, the crowd parting in her wake. Not cheering, not shouting, just watching, feeling, because they'd seen something rare. A woman stand in a room full of smoke and name the fire. And across the world, reactions exploded. Late-night hosts stumbled over monologues. Editorials rewrote themselves. Allies distanced. Opponents raged. In Eastern Europe, where Melania had once been a symbol of post-Soviet aspiration, the verdict made headlines. Slovenian-born First Lady censured for American silence. In Washington, lawmakers scrambled to manage fallout. But in living rooms, in classrooms, on timelines and feeds, the verdict became something else, a reminder that silence, even beautiful, polished, well-dressed silence, was not free of cost. Jasmine's final words played on loop across networks. She didn't scream, SS. He didn't lie, she didn't threaten, but she watched, she knew, and she chose distance over duty. That choice mattered. As the sun set on Capitol Hill, the Rose Garden looked the same, manicured, pristine. But now, millions saw it differently. Not as a garden, as a graveyard, of words unsaid, of truths unspoken, of justice delayed, but never fully denied. Because in the courtroom where the fairy tale ended, the verdict was clear. Silence is not innocence. And history, at long last, had spoken. Days passed, but the echoes did not fade. The verdict had not just named a single woman. It had indicted a pattern, a culture of complicity, a choreography of polished silences. What began as a courtroom confrontation now rippled outward like a dropped stone in a still pond, shaking institutions far beyond the chamber's walls. Some called it political theater, others called it necessary history, but no one, not even Melania's fiercest defenders, could deny it had struck a nerve. Former White House staffers began speaking out, not all of them with new revelations, but with tone, with regret. One aide described watching Melania walk through the West Wing during the January 6th chaos, like a shadow dressed in silence. Another recalled the draft letter, seeing it open on her screen, wondering why it was never sent. And then, in a move no one saw coming, Melania re-emerged. Not in court, not on television, but in a single post. A photo, black and white. Her standing on the White House balcony, alone, face turned from the camera, captioned with 2 words. I watched. That was it. No apology, no defense, just a haunting acknowledgement. The image went viral instantly. Some saw it as a confession, others saw it as cryptic, too little too late. But no matter how it was interpreted, one thing became clear: she would never be seen the same way again. Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked the halls of Congress alone. She wasn't seeking press, she wasn't gloating, she was gathering. "I don't care if the story is over," she told a colleague quietly. "The structure still stands, the scaffolding of protection, the unspoken, the unpunished. We cut down one pillar. There are others." By the end of the week, a resolution was introduced, a formal congressional investigation into the role of presidential spouses and unelected family members during states of emergency. It wasn't aimed solely at Melania. It was a blueprint. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some hailed Jasmine as a hero, a firebrand with a moral compass. Others accused her of weaponizing the past to tarnish reputations. She didn't respond. She was already on to the next name, the next document, the next silence to break. But what no one could deny, not even her critics, was this: the line between image and impact had finally been redrawn. Melania Trump had once been America's most enigmatic symbol. Grace without engagement, elegance without allegiance. But now, that image lived in contrast with testimony, with footage, with words once withheld. In lecture halls, students debated, can silence be a form of betrayal? In think pieces and podcasts, scholars reflected, had America been so desperate for poise that it ignored participation? And in that now iconic courtroom, the witness stand stood empty, but the imprint remained. A place where power was questioned, a place where silence was put on trial. And far from the spotlight, in a school library in Detroit, a young girl watched the replay of Jasmine's final speech, her hands clasped under her chin. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were wide, and something inside her shifted. Because the legacy of that day, of that confrontation, that unflinching naming of silence, wasn't just a verdict. It was a permission slip. To speak, to challenge, to remember. And as the nation moved forward, wounded, wiser, the name Jasmine Crockett etched itself not as the destroyer of an icon, but as the woman who reminded America, even in a room full of smoke and mirrors, the truth does not vanish. It waits, and it burns. The hearings had ended, the gallery emptied, reporters packed up their cameras, but somehow the room still hummed with the ghost of what had unfolded, like the air after thunder, still charged. The chair where Melania had sat was empty now, but not forgotten. It had become a symbol, not of guilt, not in the legal sense, but of the quieter questions history asks when the microphones are off and the applause fades. What does it mean to witness history and say nothing? In the weeks that followed, no formal charges were brought against her. There was no perjury, no obstruction, no crime that could be carved neatly from silence. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't a trial of laws. It was a reckoning of legacy. Melania returned to Palm Beach. No press conference, no interviews, only the occasional photograph, out to dinner, walking alone, always dressed immaculately, always silent. But in Washington, her name lingered in every hallway conversation, not as a villain, but as a symbol of something more haunting, elegant disengagement. Jasmine, meanwhile, had stepped back from the spotlight. She wasn't interested in tours or book deals. She sat with staffers in late-night meetings, reviewing files for the next committee hearing, a new case, a new face, a new silence waiting to be unraveled. One evening, she stood by her office window, watching the lights of the Capitol flicker against the night sky. Behind her, a junior aide entered quietly. "You did something no one else was willing to do," the aide said. "You made silence visible." Jasmine didn't turn. "I didn't do it to make history." "Then why?" She exhaled, soft but steady. "Because history will never remember the quiet ones. Unless as someone makes the silence loud." A beat passed between them. "And her?" the aide asked. "Do you think she ever really knew what she was doing?" Jasmine finally turned. She knew. She just chose peace over purpose. And the world let her. Outside, somewhere across the country, a mother watched the courtroom clips on her phone, holding her daughter close. In another state, a college student rewrote her thesis, now titled The Violence of Silence, Melania Trump and the Myth of Non-Participation. And in a small studio apartment in New Jersey, a young immigrant woman stared at a still frame of Melania on her screen, the rose garden photo, and whispered to herself, "That could have been me." The final silence wasn't in Melania's lips. It was in America's collective memory, deciding what to do with the figure who stood at the epicenter of power and chose beauty over battle. Jasmine had not convicted Melania Trump in the legal sense. She had done something far harder. She had made the country uncomfortable with its own myth of innocence. The final silence didn't belong to the courtroom, or to the press, or even to the First Lady. It belonged to the viewer, to the witness. To the citizen now left alone with the question, what do you do when the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the lie, but the quiet? And in that closing breath, in that echo left behind by the gavel, the answer began to form, not as a word, but as a fire. Weeks passed, then months. The headlines turned. New scandals surfaced. America, ever restless, moved on. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Something you couldn't track with a poll or capture with a soundbite. The footage from that day, Jasmine's words, Melania's unmoving gaze, the letter, the rose garden photos. It didn't just vanish. It circulated. It was studied. Taught. It landed in lecture halls, podcasts, debate stages, and private living rooms, not because it was scandalous, but because it struck a chord no one had words for. In high schools, civic teachers replayed clips from the hearing to ask their students, is silence a political act? In quiet corners of the internet, immigrant communities held watch parties, not to cheer or condemn, but to interpret. What does it mean to be silent in a house on fire? Jasmine Crockett didn't become a household name overnight, but she became something more enduring, a reference point, a silhouette against the machinery of complicity, a woman who didn't just ask questions, but forced America to reckon with the people who refused to answer. Meanwhile, the former First Lady faded further into privacy. Her defenders insisted she had no duty to speak. Her critics insisted that she did. But Melania never responded, not once. That was her strategy, and her legacy, the Immaculate Wall. One day, in a quiet gallery at the Smithsonian, a temporary installation appeared. It was a multimedia exhibit titled The Absent Eye, First Ladies in American Accountability. In the center was a looping projection of the hearing, muted. Just the images, Jasmine's face, Melania's stillness, the chair, the letter, the rose garden in full bloom. There was no plaque explaining what it meant. Visitors were left to decide for themselves. A young girl in braids stood there for a long time. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. Why didn't she say anything? Her mother didn't answer at first. Then softly, sometimes silence protects you. Sometimes it protects something worse. In Texas, Jasmine walked alone past the courthouse where it had all happened. She wasn't there to testify. Not today. Just thinking. Reflecting. The sky was gray with the promise of rain, and for once, there were no reporters, no gavel, no lights. She paused near the steps, watching a group of law students argue animatedly over something. Constitutional theory, perhaps. They hadn't noticed her. That was fine. She had come here for something else. To remind herself that silence is never neutral. It's always holding weight. A passing stranger finally recognized her and nodded. You're the one who spoke truth in that room, the man said. You're the one who spoke truth in that room, the man said. Jasmine gave a tired but genuine smile. No, she replied. I just refused to pretend silence was truth. And then she walked away, coat tucked tight against the wind, the Capitol behind her, the world still uncertain, but watching now, a little more carefully. The courtroom was closed, the hearing was over, but the echo remained. In every woman told to stay quiet, in every immigrant taught to endure, in every citizen wondering who history truly remembers, the ones who speak, or the ones who vanish behind a smile. The silence had been broken, and in its place, a reckoning, a question, a choice.